Hello, and welcome to this episode of Be the Wolf. I'm excited. Today, I'm going to talk to you about why things don't work, no matter how hard you try. If you've ever just felt like you're beating your head against the wall trying to make things work and you're doing everything right and it's working for other people, but it's not working for you, this episode is going to be an eye opener. The first thing I need to tell you is it's not your fault. Yes, there may be some things that you are doing, but those things are not your fault. So, first, I want to talk to you about some fleas. Did you know that if you put fleas in a jar, they will jump, right? Fleas can jump high, they will jump out of the jar. But if you put a lid on that jar, that the fleas will bounce and they'll hit their head. And if you 20 minutes later, after them bouncing and hitting their head, if you take the lid off of that jar, they will no longer jump out of the jar. They will only jump as high as the lid. And that makes sense. Oh, they learned there's this limit, this barrier. So we're not going to jump because it's painful to hit our head on the lid. Makes sense, right? If I ran into the wall 20 times, maybe after the 20th time, I would be like, I'm not going to run that way in that direction because there's a wall there and I'm tired of hitting my head. So it makes sense. But here's the kicker: when the fleas have babies, the babies will also only jump as far as high as the lid was. So again, you have the lid off the jar and the babies are only jumping that far. Somehow, this information has been passed down from parent to child, and the child now acts just like the parent, even though they didn't experience the hitting of their head on the lid. Now, it's not just fleas. There was an experiment done where somebody gave a little micro electric shock in the presence of lavender to some caterpillars. And they were doing an experiment. And so then the caterpillars turned into butterflies. And they gave the butterfly two paths of which way that it could go. One had the scent of lavender and the other did not. And every time the butterflies, they chose the path without the lavender, meaning they had an aversion to the lavender. So after this transformation where they basically turned into goop, they disintegrated all their cells into some goop and then reformed as something completely new, even through massive transformation. They still chose to avert from the lavender scent because it was associated with the electric shocks. And then the butterflies had babies. And their caterpillar babies also averted from the lavender. So, why am I telling you all this? There have been things passed down through the generations, through the family lines, that are painful, and fears that are carried from parent to child, from grandparents to parents to child, that going back generations and generations. And many of these fears have no lived experience, no real reason why we would be afraid of that now. So let me give you an example. My grandmother grew up in the Great Depression era. She was born in 1931, and her family was very poor. They were actually white sharecroppers in Texas, but very poor. And she had this experience of not having enough because there wasn't enough money. And what ended up happening, because there wasn't enough money, that 5 of her siblings were sent away. The boys were teenagers, so they were sent away to go make their own way as a man. And the girls were all sent to different places. She was the only one that actually remained at home. And so my grandmother has been very frugal with her money. She has held on to it tight. And she would go to different grocery stores to get the best deal because she never wanted to be in a situation where she wasn't independent, where she couldn't take care of the basic needs. And this, of course, makes sense, right? But this is the other thing, and I don't even know if she's thought about this, but not only does not having enough money mean under those circumstances and that experience that you're going to be wary and afraid you don't have your necessities. The basic first level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is your physical needs met, your shelter, your food, clothing. Not only does it mean that, but because there was not enough money, she lost most of her family. Her family was sent away because of the lack of money. And so I would guess, especially based on the things that I feel, that not only was that lack of money a fear for safety, but also a fear of losing the people you love. And so her kids, when they were very small, there wasn't a lot of money. So they had some experience of that, but there was never the experience of losing the people you love, not in that same way. Now, they did move around a lot. So as the kids, my mom and her sisters got a little older, they did have that experience of losing people they love. They lost their friends. And the moves were always based on chasing money, essentially. If my grandfather got a promotion or they wanted to move him to a different city for his job, then everybody would follow. And so there was loss of love. Again, it's a repeat. But then I was born and I didn't have those experiences. But my experience of my childhood was that we were very poor. My mom would call up the electric company and tell them and send them $5 so they wouldn't turn off the electric. But there was one day when I realized, wait a minute, my mom was making plenty of money. She was making about $2,000 a month in the early 70s. Our rent was $200. This is the time when candy bars were like 5 cents. So things were quite a bit cheaper. And so with $200 in rent, that left $1,800 a month for food and whatever else. That's plenty enough to eat. But yet I had the experience that I would be so hungry that I would eat the paper bags that my lunch came in because I thought we were so poor. And so I also grew up learning from my grandmother about how to penny pinch and how to hang on to the money. But for my perception is there was never any money for the things that you wanted. If I asked something from my mom, something that I wanted, it was always a no. And if my grandma was very generous with her family, she was very controlled everywhere else, but with her family, she was very generous. And when I would go visit her in the summer, she would buy me clothes, but it would always have to be practical. Practical came before the thing I loved. So if I loved something that was dry clean only, I could not get it because that would mean spending more money or it was just not practical for wear and tear and lasting a long time. If I wanted something that was too expensive, I could not get it. So there were these limits. If it was something I really wanted, but it was not practical, it was not allowed. So I grew up with this thinking that we had no money, even though there was money. And then feeling like I could not get the things that I wanted unless they were practical, unless they were logical and practical and made sense. And of course, all of these things make sense in the grand scheme of life, but when you translate it to everything, when it becomes like, what do I want to study in college? It was never a question about what I wanted to study. It was about what was practical and what would make money. And so, through these things that have been passed down and demonstrated, because everywhere I looked, it was demonstrated, right? My mom technically was making enough money, but she demonstrated that we were poor by the way she acted. And my grandmother had enough money to buy some clothes and stuff for me, but she demonstrated that we would not be frivolous and get something just because we love it. It would have to fall into the categories of practical. And of course, again, I'm not blaming her. That makes sense, especially from where she grew up. But what happened to me with money is that I was terrified that if I screwed up the money, that I would lose love. There was a point in my early adulthood when I needed to borrow some money to pay rent because I had gotten laid off from my job because the business closed, and I was scrambling and to find another job, and I went back to a job that I didn't like, but I did it because I needed the money. And I didn't understand in those days that you could pay rent a couple of days late and you wouldn't be out on the street, because in my mind, if I was a day late, I was going to be out on the street. And so I wasn't going to get paid until the second of the month. And so I called up my mom and I asked if I could borrow $200 for 2 days, that I would send her a check right away and date it for the second, because then she could cash it and she would send me a check. And she reamed me out. And I believed that I could never ask for anything again, because especially when it came to money, because I would lose love. Now, I didn't have the experience of losing love like my grandmother did, but that had been passed down through the generations. This fear of doing it wrong with the money, I see it in my entire family. Everybody has this, I need to do it right. I need to be practical. It's either that or it's swung the other way to being incredibly frivolous. And again, it's coming from this feeling of lack, but there's this fear of doing it wrong. And the consequences feel so dire. The consequences feel much more dire than they are. Because the truth of the matter is, me asking to borrow $200, the worst thing that was going to happen was I would get yelled at. But for me, that was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, because it was not only tapping this, like, I didn't want to be yelled at by my mother and I wanted to do it right and all of those things, but it was tapping this unresolved emotional pain about losing love that was deep in my nervous system through the generations, through the things that happened before me. And so over the years, I have spent all this time and energy and money to heal, to clear my money stuff. And it's always been focused on abundance and thinking that there is enough or not enough. But I never focused it on that fear of the loss of love until recently. And it's so strong that I am deathly afraid to talk to my grandmother about anything that I think she would not approve of when it comes to money, because I think she will disown me and not love me, and that I will lose her, that I will lose my family. And it's not this way with other people, like with a boyfriend or somebody I was living with. It was never that way, but it is with family. That deep fear that if I screw up the money, that I'm going to lose my family. And again, I have no experience of losing my family from not having enough money, but my grandmother does. And that fear has been passed down generation to generation. And so now I have it. I have that fear. So it's my responsibility to clear it so that I can live a more abundant, beautiful life. But how the fuck does somebody clear something that they have no experience of? because it wasn't like I came in and had a before losing family because there wasn't enough money. I don't have a before. I just have this sensation that you will lose your family if you screw up the money, if you don't have enough money. So that has been my reality my entire life. And this is how it is with things that are passed down from generation to generation. And of course, if it's passed down, it's also probably demonstrated in the early ages when you're a little sponge soaking up everything. People talk a lot about what your parents have told you, but it is what they demonstrated that created the more deep impact. In fact, what is demonstrated and what is generationally passed down is actually what creates the baseline operating system. So, what was demonstrated before the age of 5, before you really have a grasp on the human language, because once you have grasp on the human language, things shift a little bit because the words don't always match what's demonstrated. But while you're making sense of the world and trying to figure out how to be a human from like age 0 to 5, you're just observing everything and you're soaking in everything. So everything that is demonstrated is what the child will pick up. For some families, when it comes to money, they will act as if they don't have any money, like my mom did. And then but they will spend it wildly. And I guess we didn't have any money. So my mom must have been spending it wildly. She was doing drugs back in those days. So she was probably spending it wildly on drugs. But there was enough money to pay the bills. There was enough money to feed your child, but she was acting as if there wasn't. And she had to create the circumstance where there wasn't enough money to basically fit into that model of reality, that generational model that has been passed down. So there are other things when we're talking about this. So obviously, this is going to affect my business and my abundance in life. If I'm freaking out and worried about losing family, if I don't spend it the right way, which means the way my grandmother would spend it, and because that was been determined the right way in my mind. I'm not saying that anybody ever told me that was the right way, but that was the right way in my mind because it was my grandmother had money to actually buy me food and buy me clothing, and my mom did not. So the way my grandmother did it must be the right way, is the way I logically perceived it. And the way my grandmother saved money is one way to accumulate money over time, but it's not the only way. But so my nervous system thinks that I have to do it that one way because that's how the generations before me solved it. And going against what the generations before has done is terrifying to the nervous system because it's something different that I haven't seen demonstrated. And I did not see demonstrated when I was young and building that operating system. So there are other things too. Like, for instance, in my family, there is a sense of holding on to things. So my grandmother held on to money. She saved it. She was, like I said, very generous with her family, but she definitely made every effort to hold on to as much money as she could. She clipped coupons. They lived within a strict budget, all of those things. Now, my mom, she held on to things. She was a bit of a hoarder and she would not get rid of things. My entire life was, don't throw that out. We're going to sell it at the garage sale. And again, tied to money, right? Can't let go of it without getting some money for it. And so I also developed this hoarding thing. I held on to things for a long time, but I really held on to people. And so this has been this holding on and being afraid to let go of things was something that had been passed down through the generations. And I'm sure this probably even goes back before my grandmother. I don't want to lose, and a lot of people have this thing. If I lose this, something terrible is going to happen. And so I would hang on to people. And again, probably that ties into the people being the source of my needs, because that perception that I'm hanging on to these things because they are going to provide what I need instead of me providing what I need. And now some families have a very different way of being that has been passed down, where the person is very take charge and take responsibility and create their own destiny. My family, we have passed down, I have to hang on to these things because these things are the source of my safety, or the source of my emotional comfort, or the source of something else that I think that I need. And this is a very common thing that has been passed down for generations. In fact, it's much more rare that the other way of being has been passed down. And so for me to let go of these things has been very difficult. It was very difficult for me to start letting go of things, but I started doing that many years ago. And then now I almost tell people, don't even give me gifts because I don't really hold on to things. I have clothes, I have furniture, but I don't like having a lot of things because I don't need them to make me feel safe, make me feel loved, make me feel like I'm accomplished or anything else that I might feel like I'm lacking. Things do not fill me up from what I perceive that I lack. And it's been harder for me to let go of people, because people were something that I thought provided what I needed. They had the information that I needed. They had the strategy that I needed. They had the plan that I needed. They had the money that I needed. If I perceived that they had something that I didn't have, then they were the key to getting it. And I would hang on to them. So I had boyfriends that I perceived were confident and very full of bravado, and I didn't feel like I had that. And so I would hang on to those things. It was like subconsciously I was using them to complete me, to fill me up. But it's this thing that has been passed down, this feeling that we're lacking, that has been passed down generation to generation. And yes, in my life, I had that experience of feeling the lack. But I also know that my mother had that feeling, my grandmother had that feeling, and I'm sure it goes back generations to generations. And so as it's been passed down, it becomes more and more difficult to actually clear it, because the wounds that originally created may not be in your experience. Because for me to deathly hang on to somebody and not want to let them go, it's as if my whole safety in life depends on it. And we haven't lived in a society where your whole safety in life depends on another person in a long time. My grandma's generation was basically the last generation that was the truth for women. And even then, she divorced her husband, so it wasn't completely the truth. So your safety and your life could be fine without hanging on to another person, but it's been passed down through the generations. And so somebody like me feeling that deathly afraid to let go of somebody was a trigger from this old generational stuff. So there's another aspect to this. When we're talking about that wound, that original familial wound that's been passed down, and that feeling, it's a sensation. And then we choose to respond to it. Either we choose to respond it the way the generations before us did, our parents or our grandparents, or we try to find a different way to respond it. For instance, there in this, if you have teenagers who rebel, this is going to be the answer. If you were a teenager who rebelled, this is going to be why. And this is going to be why, even though you tried to do things a very different way, you still probably ended up with things that looked similar to your parents in the end in life. It's because what happens is there is this generational wound, this generational unprocessed, uncomfortable sensation that is passed down. So for my grandmother, and that is like the not having enough money and the losing the family creates an emotional sensation that is overwhelming and not fully processed because she was young. And it's a lot to process. And most people aren't adept, especially in their older generations, at processing emotion. So now that feeling, that sensation is in her body, and it is surrounding my mother when my mother is a fetus and growing. And so she's feeling that sensation too. And that sensation becomes a part of reality. And so she is born carrying that unprocessed wound and sensation along with her. And then I am in my mom's belly and feeling that sensation too. And that becomes a part of physical reality and so on. Sometimes we look at our parents and we're like, you're doing it in a really fucked up way. I don't know why you're doing it this way. So I'm thinking about one of my conversation I had a while back, and his father was very controlling, keeping everything really rigid and strict and super controlling. And subconsciously he is like, that is shit. And so he would be super risk taking and do really crazy things, like the total polar opposite of control. But what he didn't realize is that he was doing that in response to that same wound. It was just a different strategy to deal with it. Right. So with money, with a money wound, some people are going to hold all the money and hoard it and not let it go. Right. I did that. I was like, I would put money on a credit card, but I would not spend my real money. I would hoard the real money. I would hang on to it. And other people will just go to the other side. So they might spend with wild abandon. But the core of why they do that is the sensation. And you may not know that 95% of your decisions are made because of an emotion. And we make 35,000 decisions a day on average. Think about that. So you have emotional sensation happening in your body all the time, and that is dictating your 35,000 decisions. And so you're growing up seeing your parents do things and you're seeing it not work, right? Maybe they're a punk rocker or a hippie and they're living this free lifestyle, and you're like, that is not working for me. I need some structure and control. So you become super conservative, buttoned up, and controlling. And you're doing the opposite. But what you don't realize is that it is coming from the same feeling. One person is choosing to try to control everything, and then the other person is trying to control nothing, like trying to put no effort, just like, oh, let life will just happen, let it happen. God will let it work out for me, or whatever they might be saying, and let it go loosey goosey. There is a middle ground in this between these two polars. And that is when you process and alchemize that emotion, that sensation, that original generational wound. And when you alchemize it into something different, what happens is a balance between the two. It's been referred to sometimes as the middle way. But the middle way doesn't happen organically and doesn't actually create positive, different results in your life unless you alchemize that sensation that was likely passed down from generation to generation. And a lot of the methods people have today are not working to do that, because in therapy, you can talk yourself to death about all this shit. I can talk myself to death about money and holding on to money and why I think that I have money issues or I had money issues. But the actual wound, the sensation, has no story for me. I have made up all these stories over the years. Oh, it's because of this. Oh, it's because my mom yelled at me when I borrowed $200. That is not a deep enough wound to have made that imprint so intense that I would never ask for money from my family again, ever, because I got yelled at once. No, that wound, the wound of fear of losing my family, runs so deep that it's not even mine. I don't have that. Now, if I had lost 5 of my siblings because there was not enough money, that wound might make me afraid to screw up money, might make me so afraid to spend money on the wrong thing, might make me so afraid to ask for help when it came to finances. And I tell you, every time that I've done that, every time that I've asked for help when it came to finances or strapped through the thing, it was like death. These things that other people can just be like, "Oh, hey, can I borrow some money?" Or, "Hey, I need some help figuring this out." But for me, it felt like death. And the truth is, I never had a money experience that was that strong. It was just passed down through the generations. And I'm carrying that fear and not being able to operate from a free and clear place because of it. I can't just say, hey, even to borrow money from a bank feels funky, because if my family finds out that I borrowed money from the bank and I have debt, then they will disown me and then I will end up with no family. And that's what it feels like. It feels like death. It feels like I'm going to be banished. And that is way too big of a wound for anything that I actually experienced in this life. And so, as you consider the things that you have issues with, maybe you like to hang on to things. Maybe you have a really hard time making a decision because maybe you're afraid of what you will lose. But yet you had a relatively okay life. It wasn't like you had a lot of crazy trauma or something. I had a lot of crazy trauma, but my trauma was never about money. That was not my trauma. That was the generations before me trauma that I carried in my DNA, in my system, and have the responsibility to heal. Now, I don't have to, but if I had kids, I would have passed that along. It is, and I even see in, oh, it's so wild. I even see in my cousin's daughter some of the things that she says about money. I'm like, oh, it's that same way of thinking. And there's no way that she's never spent time around my mom, but she talks and says things just like my mom when it comes to money. And so there's this stuff that's just been passed down generation to generation. So begin to think about what has been passed down for you. What are the things that make no logical sense? Why you cannot break the behavior? Why you cannot heal the wound? And the other thing to think about, and this is important, is when we're talking about generational stuff, because you have no experience of a before and after, that it is so deeply embedded in your system that to go against it feels like the whole world is going to come down, come crashing down. And it feels like your reality is going to crumble. If you imagine sitting on a beach and all of a sudden the sky just starts to disintegrate, the waves and the ocean just starts to disintegrate, and the sand dunes and everything starts to disintegrate, and you're left floating in nothingness. This is what it feels like, because every ounce of you has that memory of that wound when you were still in the womb. So it has nothing, it does not know anything without it. And if it does not know anything without it, if you know nothing without it, that's what it feels like you're stepping into if you go against whatever strategies have kept you and or your family away from feeling that feeling. Even if you did the rebellious strategies that were very different from your family. So it's important to understand that breaking these generational patterns is not easy and that it feels to your nervous system like the whole world is disintegrating, because for it, it is. Because these generational things are the fabric of your reality. It's the fabric of how your world works. There's this book I read years ago, Clan of the Cave Bear, and it's basically about this woman who meets this clan. She's a more evolved Homo sapien. She's a more evolved human, and they're more Neanderthals. And they're very concerned about her because she doesn't have the memories. She doesn't have the memories of how it is to survive, what you need to do to survive on that land. And they were very pleased when she ended up mating with another person in the tribe, and their baby had the memories, because then they felt like the baby would be safe. The baby would be okay because they carried all the information from the generations before. But perhaps in this land of, we're not in danger in our society every day in a basic way. Our life is more safe than it has ever been for any generation before us. And so perhaps we don't need to carry the knowledge from before, but what we need to do is be willing to let everything disintegrate so we can access new knowledge on how to operate moving forward. This is what being the wolf is all about. It's about not taking the past, whether it's your own past, your own experiences, or your generations before you experiences, but stepping into life in a new way so that you can actually access the life that is truly meant for you. And so if you've been trying to make things work because you can see what is possible, but you just can't fucking get there, this might be why. This might be why. If any of this has resonated with you, come to my Be the Wolf calls. They're about accessing the freedom of being you. Come to them on Wednesday mornings at 7 a.m. Pacific. They're complimentary. All you have to do is sign up. You'll get the Zoom link every Wednesday, 7 to 8 p.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Eastern. If you want to come to my live events, my work is, whether it's the coaching, whether it's the live events, it's about getting to the crux of what is keeping you from having the life that is meant to be yours. It's about being the wolf. It's about accessing all of who you are. And the generations before you have shoved down different aspects of who they were to stay safe, to make sure those wounds didn't happen again. But subconsciously, they're going to keep happening generation to some degree, or at least the perception of them will happen. And in that, the wounds will carry forward until somebody takes a stand and is the cycle breaker and heals it all. And maybe that's you. If that's you, come to a call, come to a live event. I do them monthly in LA. I do a couple fire walks a year. Maybe coaching is right for you. Maybe you're ready to go all in. But if you want to be the cycle breaker, and you know, after listening to this conversation, that some of the stuff that you've been carrying is not yours, let's have a conversation. You can reach out to me via the links below. You can sign up for the call. Just show up, take a step. All right. Thanks for listening. And we will see you all next time on Be the Wolf. Bye, everyone.